Well, Anna, thank you very much, and thank you for the offer to speak to the audience this evening. And I can see so many friends' names that I recognise popping up in the bottom bar. So great to see you all again. So this is me, Tim Hodgetts. I'm the Surgeon General of the United Kingdom Armed Forces, and I'm also the Senior Medical Advisor for NATO through my role of Chair of the Committee of Medical Chiefs. Just for full disclosure, I'm also a trustee of London's Air Ambulance, and I'm sure this audience will fully understand what that entails. And I am a trustee of the Poppy Factory. That does what it says on the tin, quite literally. And I'm a trustee and co-founder of the charity Citizen Aid, which is information, education, and equipment for the public in how to respond effectively and safely to a deliberate attack. But this evening, what I've been asked to talk to you about is some leadership lessons, and lessons that I really wish I had known earlier in my career, particularly in relation to crisis and change. And I've got 10 lessons for you, and I'm going to count down from 10 through to 1 and finish off with that bronze, silver, and gold lesson. But before I do, I'll just define leadership and management from my perspective, just take what I regard as a favourite definition. You're going to need to hang on because we are going to need to move quite quickly, so we get through the slides and leave plenty of time for questions. And as Anna said, if you've got questions, please drop them into the chat as we go through, and then we'll pick them up at the end. So what about that definition then? What's the difference between leadership and management? And there are many definitions you'll find in the literature, but my favourite is that management is about getting things done, but leadership is about inspiring others to get things done. And it follows that all leaders are managers, but not necessarily all managers are leaders. And in the military context, we have an additional nuance, because we might have to inspire people to do things that are actually counterintuitive to their personal safety. So what's the first lesson? In at number 10 is that decisiveness is the most valuable leadership characteristic. And this was identified by Napoleon, who said that there's nothing more difficult and more precious than being able to decide. And he was talking about his staff officers. But I actually like the definition from General Colin Powell, who has a number of leadership principles, and I would encourage you to look those up on the internet. And he talks about the 40-70 principle, or the principle of bounded rationality. And that's if you have less than 40% of the information, you probably haven't got enough to make a safe decision. But if you wait until you've got more than 70%, then you may have waited too late, because the enemy has already acted. The enemy has got inside your OODA loop: observe, orientate, decide, and act. And in medicine, the enemy is often time. And in emergency medicine and hospital care, you'll know only too well that you have to act on limited information and start to treat your patient, and then adjust if necessary, dependent on further information that becomes available. So I'm just going to test your decisiveness now, and I'm going to ask you in a moment to raise your little yellow hand. Now, I don't know whether that's going to show, Anna, but I'll just allow people to do it anyway. So the situation is in 1989 in Germany at the British Military Hospital, where I was a junior doctor. And this was the time when the IRA were very active in Germany, and there were 2 car bombs placed in the street where I lived. There was drive-by shootings outside at the military hospitals and drive-by shootings at the Channel Port. And therefore, it perhaps was no surprise when a telephone bomb warning was phoned through to the British military hospital. So you've got a choice. Do you evacuate, or not evacuate, or are you not sure? So I'm just going to give you a moment to think. Would you evacuate? Put up your little yellow hand. Would you not evacuate? Put up your little yellow hand. Or don't you know? And the answer, I can tell you, is evacuate. Or don't evacuate. The incorrect answer is I don't know. Because in a crisis, you have to make a decision. People are looking towards you to make that decision. You're making it on limited information. You might have to change your decision over time, but you do need to make one. And in 1989, I started to write my first book as a result of this exposure to terrorism, and also having sat at the first diet of the diploma in immediate medical care, where there were no revision notes. I wrote revision notes for that diploma, and it included a number of exercises of multiple casualties, one of which was a terrorist bomb. And this turned out to be really important thinking, and demonstrated to me the rule, or the leadership lesson that comes in at number 9, that you can lead from anywhere in the organization. Because just a couple of years later, in 1991, in fact, on the 2nd of November at 3:53 in the afternoon, I remember it well, it was a Saturday afternoon, it was during the Rugby World Cup final, when the IRA targeted the hospital where I was working as a doctor. And it blew up, the bomb blew up the operating theatre, as you can see on the slide, which was destroyed. The emergency department was destroyed. The intensive care unit was destroyed. The hospital was on fire. The ground floor collapsed into the basement, and the first floor collapsed into the ground floor. I was first on scene. I acted as the medical commander, evacuated the hospital of the patients that were in it, and set up a treatment facility in the road for those who were then rescued out of the rubble. But I was not the senior person on scene. In fact, I was the junior officer on scene. I was a captain when my colleagues were majors. But through the education I'd done, through the diploma in immediate medical care, through the conditioning about thinking about these situations, having been exposed to terrorism, having written that book, I was the right person to take charge. So leadership is defined by your actions and not by your appointment, or indeed by your rank. And I just reaffirm that you can lead from anywhere in the organization where you work, so long as you're decisive, and that decisiveness is absolutely dependent on your knowledge, on the confidence that you exude, and your ability to communicate. What that incident actually did for me was to provide what is referred to in the literature as post-traumatic growth, not post-traumatic stress, post-traumatic growth, because not all critical situations that you're exposed to lead to PTSD. Some can be very developmental. And I took that learning, I reflected on it very hard, and then the following year, with colleagues in Manchester and Birmingham, set up the Major Incident Medical Management and Support course with the 7 principles that many of you will be familiar with, and wrote a couple of supporting books, a manual and a waterproof scene guide. So at number 8 then, it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. And I'm also reminded of the paraphrase of that from a former boss of mine, General Sir Richard Barrons, who said, "Proceed until apprehended." And this allows me to introduce the concept, if you're not already familiar with it, of mission command. And if you think in the military setting, particularly the army setting, where the soldiers are very dispersed on the ground, they will understand the intent of their commander, and they will continue to prosecute against that intent until a point where they need a further order, and at that point they will contact the headquarters for that direction. But in general terms, they keep going without having to ask permission each time. So mission command requires empowerment to go on the ground and discharge the commander's intent. And that empowerment requires trust. And what trust does is it generates followership. And to be a leader, you need to have followers. And it is that followership that creates a true leader. So at number 7 is about moral courage. And moral courage, I would say, is as important as physical courage. Now, I know there are people online, because I saw their names pop up, who have been in difficult situations in military settings and have definitely shown physical courage. And I can think of situations myself where I've had to fly into a poppy field during a firefight while the mortars are walking into your position and your helicopter is strafed with machine gun fire. And in his description of courage, the anatomy of courage, Lord Moran, after the Second World War, described it as strength in the face of fear, pain, or grief. So I think we would all have that understanding of what it takes to demonstrate physical courage. But what about moral courage? Moral courage, there's 2 aspects I want to bring out here. First of all, it can be about standing up for what you genuinely believe in. And this can be difficult if you have opposition from your peers or your superiors, if it's going to be a really long road to get to a change, if there are potentially adverse consequences for you standing up. So if you are going to be vilified or even suspended for speaking out. And indeed, it's difficult if there are limited or no resources to help you. And just let me give you an example. In 2003, 2004, we went through the process of introducing tourniquets for individual soldiers in the British Army, and in fact achieved this by 2005. But this was a really uphill struggle. We had substantial resistance internally and specifically from our own orthopedic surgeons who said, if you do this, then there will be multiple unnecessary limb amputations. But we did get it over the line, and the evidence has proven this to be absolutely life-saving and has not shown unnecessary amputation to be a byproduct. In fact, it has ensured that the very people who are intended to be saved have become those unexpected survivors. But I went through the same process again as we stood up the charity Citizen Aid to try and convince the civilian community of what we've been able to convince the military community, that tourniquets are an appropriate intervention when you have life-threatening limb bleeding that cannot be controlled by any other means. And it has taken a substantial struggle to ensure that the voluntary aid societies now support this as they do, and it is in the Voluntary Aid Society manual. But moral courage is also about speaking out when you can see that something is wrong, and we've got a very contemporary example of that in the news just this week, where doctors did speak out against Lucy Letby, the special care baby nurse who murdered a series of vulnerable infants. But the doctor was made to feel that he was a problem. So if you are going to be vilified or even suspended for speaking out, that is going to dissuade you from doing so. And in the National Health Service, somebody who speaks up is often branded a whistleblower, which I think is a very pejorative term. If you speak up when something is wrong in the military, and specifically if you have a solution to right that, we don't call you a whistleblower, we call you a leader. And I did have a specific example of speaking out when something was persistently wrong. In 2000, 2001, I ran a research project which identified the risk factors for avoidable in-hospital cardiac arrest. And I published these in a series of articles in the journal Resuscitation, together with the evidence-based solution and the first evidence-based activation criteria for a medical emergency team. I produced an evidence-based booklet and a training DVD that was circulated free to every trust in the country. So this was 2001. In 2012, the National Confidential Inquiry into Patient Outcomes and Deaths looked at avoidable in-hospital cardiac arrest and identified exactly the same risk factors that we had more than 10 years previous to that. And as a result of this, I wrote to the medical director of the National Health Service, and I said, we gave you the solution across the NHS 10 years ago. When does organisational inertia become institutional neglect? And I think a couple of the examples I've identified there with in-hospital cardiac arrest prevention and with tourniquets, it can take years to get this change to stick. So you have to be determined, particularly when you know it is the right thing to do. And I would just ask yourself, are you that fish on the right-hand side of the screen that is prepared to swim in the opposite direction? Are you prepared to challenge the status quo? And if you are, you should reassure yourself that only dead fish follow the flow. And also reassure yourself that swimming uphill, swimming upstream, actually, I would say, can build strength and resilience because it is the strongest salmon that managed to make it to the top of the stream. At least that's what I keep telling myself, that it will build strength and resilience. At number 6, I would say you can and you must make time for what is important. But in order to do that, you have to understand what is your most productive time. Now, I am somebody who likes to get up very early, and my best working time is between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m. So if I want to do some strategic thinking, if I want to do some creative writing, that is the time I will get up and do it. Now, I'm not very good late at night. I can't work late at night. I fade early. But some of you will be owls, and you will do your very best work late at night. Some may do your best work in the middle of the afternoon. It doesn't really matter, but you must be able to recognize your most productive time, and don't just fill it with email, fill it with something that is productive. In terms of learning, and anybody who's done a master's degree will have been taught about reflective practice, and I would absolutely recommend taking time for reflection, because it does give insight and it does give the opportunity for professional growth. And certainly the difficult situations that I've been in over the last 25, 30 years, I've written an anthology of contemporary war poetry because I have reflected on a difficult situation, immediately turned it into a little poem, which I can then box off and say, right, deal with that, move on to the next challenge. So this particular image, I will just tell you my reflective poem called The Black Snake. Long and black with high gloss back is our most deadly snake. Through glass belly the mourners see, written on the caskets draped, the legion's flags with respect sag, dipping as the snake glides by. A petal shower forms a thin cover as families in silence cry. This wooden meal's far from unreal, a consequence of modern war, where choice, not need, impels we feed, the virtuous cycle to endure. Take time for reflection. At number 5, I would say it's hard, but really worthwhile to make something simple. And I'm reminded of this phrase from Winston Churchill, who apologized, saying he was sorry for writing a long letter, but he didn't have time to write a short one. It really does take time to make things simple. And going back to Colin Powell, again, one of my favorite leaders, identified that great leaders are almost always great simplifiers because they can cut through the argument and they can provide a solution that everyone can understand. Now, I would say that I've spent my whole career trying to be a serial simplifier and have achieved this in some respects. So I've come up with a number of mnemonics, some of which you will be familiar with. So in the multiple casualty incident scenario, the mnemonic CSCAT, Command, Safety, Communications, Assessment, Triage, Treatment, Transport, which underpins MIMS, Major Incident Medical Management and Support. And that comes from our work in 1992 to come up with the MIMS course. But in 1998, I wanted to simplify first aid for the whole army and use those MIMS principles of scene management, then individual patient management. But 7 principles was too much for the individual soldier, so I condensed that to control, then act, assess, communicate, triage, and then there was a series of treatment drills, and those principles still endure today. And then the messages, methane. I invented methane, or actually ethane at the time, in a golf club in Stirling in 1992, when I listened to a police officer describe his experience from the Lockerbie aircraft crash, when he actually used the mnemonic chalet. And I thought, well, that's all the right information, but in the wrong order. So chalet became ethane, and then within a year, we were teaching methane in the MIMS course when it became clear that we needed to add that major incident standby or declared. And the MIST message, which I'm sure you are familiar with, I invented in 1994 when in Australia. And in 2005, we moved from ABC to CABC, where that first C is catastrophic hemorrhage, and just one letter change of a simple mnemonic had a profound impact on the way that we practice and equip for emergency and pre-hospital care. Next then, at number 4, is the need for an adaptive leadership style. And if you read the leadership literature, you will find 7 characteristic leadership styles. But what I would say is that many leaders, or many great leaders, have multiple leadership styles, and they adapt the leadership style according to the situation. And I've certainly seen this when on tour versus when working in the NHS, because the more direct leadership styles that may work in a conflict situation are not necessarily the leadership styles that work in that more collegial NHS setting. So you have to be able to adapt your style according to the situation. And just to give some examples of when certain styles may have utility, in a situation where there's higher uncertainty and where the team is relatively inexperienced, so you've got a new team forming as the field hospital stands up, or indeed if there's internal conflict in the team, then you need that transactional, directive, commander type style. But as the team becomes more familiar with each other, as become well described, just like the Formula One pit crew on every wheel and doing the fill up of petrol, then it becomes more self-managing and more participative in style. But sometimes when something unusual occurs and you have to disruptively change your practice, you need that transformational style. So at number 3, and getting the bronze award, is that multinationality makes for slower but better decisions. And I've worked in multinational situations in the deployed setting, where I have been the medical director of a multinational field hospital that was half Danish, a quarter American, a quarter British, and a handful of Estonians. And the positives are that you can take the very best of practice from each of those nations and blend them together. And also in the current challenges that we are potentially facing today, where we're looking again at war fighting at scale, and we all have limited military medical capabilities, then by combining some of those capabilities in multinational facilities, then we will be able to burden share when operating at that scale, or indeed for duration. But there are predictable challenges with multinationality, and first and foremost is the language. But also you can find that each nation has a rather stereotypical culture, and nations do, I would say, perform to their stereotypical cultures. They may have different scope of practices for doctors, nurses, paramedics, and they may be operating to slightly different guidelines. So you have to get some standardization to support interoperability. And if you're interested in multinationality, I would strongly commend to you the work of Gert Hofstede. You can go on the internet and find his website and compare any number of nations and see the potential frictions and how you will therefore avoid those frictions when you put nations together into one facility. At number 2, getting the silver award, is that the world craves certainty in crisis and change. And I'm reminded of the aphorism of the 15th century physician to Henry V, Nicholas Colnay, who said that it's the mark of a mature mind to bear uncertainty with equanimity. In other words, you have a mature mind if you can tolerate uncertainty. And if you are operating in an environment where there is very high certainty and very high agreement, then you don't really need leadership, because people will just get on and do it. It's when there is high uncertainty and high disagreement where the leadership is really necessary, where that leadership magic starts to happen. And it's where perhaps the military try and assert some order in relative chaos or confusion, and we have various tools to do this. One of the most difficult things, one of the most complex things you can do is to invade another country. And the military will place over that complex situation a single plan on a page, a campaign plan, and there are tools or descriptions within that campaign plan which people can simply understand and work their way through that complexity. I have been following a model of complex change for quite some years, and it's Kotter's model. And there are 8 steps in Kotter's model, which starts by jangling the organization into a sense of urgency, create the crisis, then build a team who are going to resolve that solution, generate a vision that you communicate widely in the strapline of your email, and every time you meet the chief executive in the lift or the lunch queue, you're able to communicate your vision. You remove obstacles, which you might think are money, but I would say are usually people. There might be people in charge of money, but it is usually people. You generate some short wins, particularly when there's going to be a long haul, to maintain momentum and build on that change and anchor it in the culture of the organization. So this is Kotter's 8-step model of change. And it's in his book, Leading Change, which I would strongly commend to you. But what I've learned over the last 20, 25 years of following this model is that Kotter was wrong. There are not 8 steps, there are 9. And the first and the 9th step is actually the first. And it is that you must understand and frame the problem. Take time to analyze the external factors to the organization and the internal factors to the organization that are driving the change in innovation, because otherwise you could go off in the wrong direction and start changing the wrong things. Now, just as an illustration, I've told you already about that in-hospital cardiac arrest prevention initiative, and I used Cotter's model of change across a whole hospital. And within a year, we had reduced in-hospital cardiac arrest by 50% following that model of change. At number one, change may appear easy, but people can be difficult. And Basil Liddell Hart, who was a strategist between the world wars, said that the one thing harder than getting a new idea into the military mind is getting an old one out. Well, substitute military mind for any mind, and indeed any corporate mind, and you will find it is the hardest thing to do, to get people to get rid of their preconceptions and have an open mind to accept that change. Cott has written another book about this to help us try and understand why people are resistant to change. And the book's called That's Not How We Do It Here. Again, I commend it to you. And what I've also learned in implementing change, particularly in large organizations, is that you have to do it in stages and beware of trying to implement too much change all at once. So imagine the pigeons. If you throw a whole loaf of bread at the pigeons, they will fly away. But if you throw crumbs, then they will stay to feed, and they will take the next handful of crumbs that you throw at them. So think about what is manageable change that isn't going to frighten your audience. What about toxic leaders in your organization? Because every organization has toxic leaders, and indeed large organizations, it's been estimated that 2% of them are the far spectrum of toxic leaders, and they're called workplace psychopaths, who will stand on the heads of anybody to get at what they particularly want. And you can find that the personalities of toxic leaders absolutely negatively affects the organizational climate. So how does a big organization deal with a toxic leader? How would you deal with a toxic leader? You'll find in big organizations that these people seem to get promoted. He says, as the Surgeon General. What would you do? Would you report on their behaviors? Would you be prepared to stand up to these individuals and confront them? Often it's extremely difficult to do. But what I hope you would do is, at the very least, seek out an experienced colleague who's prepared to listen to you and get help from them, even if you are not prepared because you are concerned about confronting the individual. I did write an article back in 2016 with Chris Gibson and Pete Mahoney, which we called The Process Zoo. And the central argument of that article, which is in Management Today, was that if you work in an organization or part of an organization where it's become more important to do it the right way than to do the right thing, then you're in a process zoo, and come and meet the animals. And those animals might be the benign and passive sheep who just continues to do the wrong thing because they don't know any better and they don't challenge it. It might be the benign and active process monkey who's trying to tell everybody to follow the process. It's the important thing to do, and in process-oriented organizations, these people will definitely get promoted. It might be the passive and malignant sloth, and these are individuals who will slow things down to their own desired rate of work. I'm sure those who work in the operational setting, pre-hospital care, emergency departments, where we spin very quickly, get very frustrated by finance and commercial, which move extremely slowly. And then there is the porcupine, the active and malignant, who will roll themselves into a ball and project all sorts of spines of, you must follow this process in order to protect themselves. So my final thought is how you might prepare for leadership. And it's a quote from Oscar Wilde that it's what you read when you don't have to that determines what you will be when you can't help it. So what are you reading today? What books are preparing you for leadership? So in summary, I hope I've identified the difference between leadership and management, which is inspiration. And I've given you 10 precepts of leadership, counting down to my bronze, silver, and gold, which I really hoped I would have known a little bit earlier in my career. Maybe they will be of use to you. Perhaps you can reflect on how they might apply to your own situation. Thank you very much for your attention. I will now happily take those questions. Anna, over to you.
Absolutely brilliant. Just what a fantastic presentation.